1, 2, 3, listen.
Welcome to the Shoot the Shiitake podcast with me, Father Leo, a Catholic priest on a mission to bring people of all different backgrounds together to learn, to love, and to accept one another. Even if we disagree with each other, we've got to be willing to at least listen to each other as God does with us and as God intends for us to do with each other. This unique podcast isn't going to get into the deep and theological things about the Catholic Church, but rather make those things practical and realistic for our life simply by listening to each other. And this week, we have the pleasure of listening to Father Roger Landry. He's a priest of the Diocese of Fall River in Massachusetts, writes regularly for the National Catholic Register, the Anchor, the Pilot, and other publications. He was the on-site commentator for EWTN's coverage of the 2013 Papal Conclave that elected Pope Francis, and he often appears on various Catholic radio programs. He's the author of the 2018 book, Plan of Life, Habits to Help You Grow Closer to God. He speaks widely on controversial issues in faith and public life, and more importantly, he's a good friend of mine. And today, we are going to talk about the real meaning of freedom. So sit back as I dive into a deep dish discussion with Father Roger Landry here on Shoot the Shiitake. Father Landry, it's great to have you on and talk about something that has been confusing for a lot of people. Now, in full disclosure, as we heard in the intro, we know each other from way back when. I mean,
don't just know each other, Father Leo. We're good friends.
Yeah, I mean, but like from way back when. It's amazing. And you're now in a very unique position, still obviously in your priestly capacity, but also I would call a real thought influencer in many ways. I know you love that title, a thought influencer, I get it. But I want to get influenced in the theology of freedom. And we know what the Catechism says, and all you've got to do is go to Article 3 of Part 3, Life in Christ, and it begins with freedom. So let's talk about some of the theological components to freedom because it's easily abused. So if you could give us a working definition for people who might not be theologically trained, how would you describe freedom?
I would say freedom is the self-mastery that allows us to love, that allows us to have real responsibility toward God and toward others, that allows us to actually do the good. Many people think that freedom is this capacity to do whatever we choose to do, whenever we choose to do it, however we choose to do it. And if somebody else gets hurt, well, that's the only restriction. But as long as somebody doesn't say he or she is hurt, then we can go forward. That's actually a certain type of slavery. We can be enslaved, for example, to our instincts. We can be enslaved to our anger. We can be enslaved to our attractions. That's not real freedom, giving in to those types of slavery. So let's just take gluttony. If somebody's a glutton and has a real addiction to food, the person can continue to eat, and at one level, the person's free to buy as many Twinkies or chocolate cakes or ice cream quarts as they can, but they're enslaved to the food. We could talk about alcoholism, we could talk about other addictions, but even though on one level, there's a certain freedom to choose to do something, that freedom is now being manipulated by an underlying slavery. And so St. Paul told us in his 5th chapter of his letter to the Galatians that for freedom, Christ has set us free. Remember what Jesus said to Pontius Pilate. He said, "For this I have come into the world to testify to the truth." And earlier in John's Gospel, he will say, "If you keep my word, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." So freedom is not pretending that we're God and trying to determine right and wrong.
So you mentioned something, and I'm glad that you brought up truth because it was going to be part of my questions, because this is, by the way, the first of 2 parts. This part 1 is kind of getting into the doctrine, the actual teaching, the dogma, the definition of what freedom is. The second part is going to be about making it practical. How do we do it? And you mentioned truth because it's connected to freedom obviously in an intimate way. Because if they think that, I don't know, like say fake news, for example, is true, it's going to limit their capacity to act freely. So tell me, what is the actual connection between freedom and truth?
Let's go from the photographic negative of it. We all know that ignorance enslaves us. That if we don't know what we're doing, we're not free. If we've never learned how to play the piano, we're not free to make it sound good. If we don't know the law of gravity and we climb up to the top of the Empire State Building and try to go for a fly, we're going to be in for a rude awakening. There are truths about the world, there are truths about us, there are truths about others that need to be respected. And when we're ignorant about what those are, we go about blind. And we know that, you know, if we were truly incapable of seeing, we wouldn't be free to go about as we please. We're going to be sort of listening and responding to other things, but there's something missing there. And that darkness of the intellect actually makes us susceptible to manipulation, can bind us to the few things we know with a certain rigor, such that we're not capable of learning other things and continuing to grow. So truth is one of the essential components. St. John Paul II, when he was our age, which is very young, by the way, for everybody.
Incredibly young.
When St. John Paul II was our age, he basically put 4 coordinates to freedom. That freedom's tied to the truth. So we're being liberated from ignorance, to the good, so that we're being liberated from subjectivity and we can get outside of ourselves towards something that's actually going to make us good. Third, to love, because the real purpose of freedom is so that we can freely give ourselves to God and others. And then lastly, to responsibility. We're not free if we have no duties in our freedom. We must reverence, we must respect others. And so those are like the 4 legs of the chair of freedom in which we're supposed to sit and then move and live and have our being.
Okay, and so this, first of all, thank you for that, because it sounds just like the catechism to me. And that's exactly where I kind of refer people once again to get a deeper teaching of it. Now let's just look at the word freedom. You are a linguist, and we have in English, obviously, freedom. You know, I mean, but in say like Latin is culture, what would the word freedom be?
So it would be libertas.
Exactly. So liberal, in a way, is connected to it. And so I want to kind of get into the way the world, or perhaps even politics, sees freedom and how it can be better understood with a theological understanding of freedom.
Sure. If we go back just a bit to what St. Paul said, he said, for freedom, Christ has set us free. And in that one sentence, you've got 2 different notions of freedom.
That's right.
You've got freedom from, so Christ freed us from the inheritance of sin and from slavery to sin, but he freed us from that so that we could use our freedom for a bigger purpose. And so that is for growing in the truth, growing in goodness, loving, and responsibility, as we just talked about. Our typical secular notion of freedom is pretty much reduced on both scores. So it's freedom from any restrictions we don't really want to live by, any rules we don't want to obey, whether they're driving rules, whether they're
paying for something.
Bingo. I mean, we've got a lot there, but also it's been cheapened at the level of what our freedom is for. And so in our particular culture, it's freedom for whatever pleasures we seek and whatever pains from which we want to try to liberate ourselves. And that's where you would get, for example, euthanasia, that if I'm really suffering at the end of my life, I should be free to be Lord of my life and just end it here and now, because that's what my freedom is for. It's not tied to the truth that there is, for example, a God, or that we're limited creatures and that we'll suffer. Not tied to the moral good. Think about the bad example that would be set for so many by an act of suicide in a circumstance like that. Not really tied to love, not really tied to a genuine stewardship or responsibility for one's own life and for all those others who are looking for us. And so that's the impoverished notion that we Christians need to enrich anew with what has been given to us as an incredible inheritance over the course of a couple thousand years by Jesus and the saints.
Okay, and I'm glad that you talked about it, because I can look to the catechism and understand freedom from like a theoretical point of view, but freedom is actually a person.
Mm-hmm.
Freedom is actually Christ himself. And this is what a lot of people don't know how to do. And although it might seem very like I'm going into part 2 for the practicalities, I'm not. I'm still trying to think to the theory, which is supposed to be incarnate. How the heck does Jesus give us freedom? This is a real basic question that a lot of people may not even ask. But Jesus is the author. He is what freedom looks like, and he is the giver of freedom. But how?
So the first is he liberates us from the shackles of sin. Doesn't mean we're never going to sin again, but it does mean that sin no longer has dominion over us.
Tell me what that means exactly, because again, a lot of people don't even know what sin is, how much it has. I mean, I guess in a psychological way, be an addiction. They would maybe look at it like that. But how is it affecting our spirit?
So sin changes our mind. We don't see things clearly. We don't see the good very easily. It changes our capacity to choose, so that choosing the good is harder, and choosing what is going to be harmful, even spiritually suicidal, is easier and harmful for others. And so the first thing Jesus does is he liberates us from that shackle, which doesn't mean that we're not going to be tempted anymore, but it does mean that we've been given back this capacity out. So the one example that I'd give is, let's just say somebody was an alcoholic for a while and couldn't give up that next drink and was just one after another. The person goes to a treatment program, starts to get an AA. This person's now gaining freedom. He's no longer enslaved to the booze, but he knows that the booze is there. If he has that first drink, he's going to get sucked back into it. What Jesus has done to us is he's taken us through this massive spiritual rehab, which we call baptism, and the sacraments and the moral life, and how he comes to abide in us, so that we actually have been given anew that choice that Adam and Eve had. We're no longer like the addict who technically has the capacity to say no to the temptation, but there's such an inner drive to say yes to the temptation that the person's not really free, and brought us to the stage in which we can choose between good and evil.
So people are going to ask, though, it's like, so I get it. That sounds very spiritual and good, but how does Jesus exactly do that? I mean, you said like maybe people have been baptized and they're still struggling with it all. So what does Jesus do exactly to give us freedom?
So part of this is a mystery.
Yes. That's why I'm asking you. You're smarter than I am.
Yeah. So part of it's a mystery in the way that Jesus actually does it. But the first thing is he won for us freedom again, strangely, by his passion, death, and resurrection. That he took our sin and our slavery, you could say, upon himself, and it died with him on the cross.
Okay.
That makes all the rest of this possible. But if I can, I want to share something with you, because back in 2008, when Pope Benedict came to the U.S., his entire trip was talking about freedom.
Yes, I remember.
When he came to Yankee Stadium, he talked specifically in answer to your question, Father Leo. He said, real freedom, the path that leads to true freedom. I'm sorry, he said this at Nationals Park in Washington, D.C. I thought it was, I'll get to New York in a second. The path that leads to true freedom is the path of a sincere and generous imitation of Christ. And then at Yankee Stadium, he said, the gospel teaches us that true freedom, the freedom of the children of God, is found only in the self-surrender that's part of the mystery of love in Christ. So when Christ has set us free, he set us free for love. And he doesn't leave us on our own and give us a list of ingredients saying this is how you cook the dish of love. He actually comes and helps us to choose. And that...
Well, that just requires people to believe that Jesus is real, that he's living, and that he wants to have a relationship with us. So a personal relationship with Christ on a very basic level, just getting to know him and imitating his virtues is going to be a key thing. Now, I want to jump into this because this might take a little bit of time. We might actually bleed into the next segment of it all, though. But it seems to me that a lot of people think that liberals are more loving than conservatives. And I hate using such basic black and white terms, but we just said it, this idea of free is liberal, liberal is free. and yet they seem to have like a kindness because they're open to everybody. I want you just to maybe help us give some dogmatic approaches to making sure we have some distinctions. And how shall I say, are liberals more loving because they are more accepting? There's less baggage, there's less requirements. It's free.
So it comes to understanding what real love is. So one of the main distinctions between, to just use the political categories, which neither of us like to use, but just
Not at all.
shorten the conversation a little bit. Conservatives in general try to love people with the truth about the way things are. Liberals try to love the people as they are without so much of a reference toward the truth. And so an individual conservative and an individual liberal could love more or less than the other, and both could love in a truly saintly way. But there are two different approaches here that we're talking about. And if we're going to love somebody fully, it involves two things. Not loving somebody conditionally, that I'm only going to love you if you change. And so in that way, liberals start off in their sort of greater acceptance with a loving of the person as the person presently is. There's a little bit of an advantage there overall. Conservatives try to love with the truth and say, I don't want to leave you there. If you are there, but that's not where real full flourishing is going to happen as a human being, that's not where you're really going to find happiness. I want to take you there. And so that's, they both liberals and conservatives accentuate something about genuine love, but a lot of the times they miss the other point. So there are a lot of conservatives, for example, who will just immediately label people. Because you do this, you're in this category. And that's not adequately loving. At the same time, liberals will just say, whatever you want to do, I'm just going to love you like that. And I don't care if it leads you to unhappiness or suicide or a life of misery in this world. We've got to tie somebody to the truth at the same time. And so we love them unconditionally with their dignity, but because we respect their dignity, we take them from where they are to where Christ would eventually want them to be.
I love this because this kind of comes back full circle as we kind of conclude this first part of our Shoot the Shiitake, getting deep into what freedom means, because we know it's not free. It's so cliche, but it's true. If we only approach freedom through the lens of biology or psychology or sociology, we're never going to have a complete understanding of it. We need theology. And so I want to thank Father Roger Landry for breaking open for us that freedom is really a person. It is Jesus Christ himself. And when I return on this Shoot the Shiitake, I'm going to give you my carry-out order. What did I learn from this pretty intense discussion from a pretty smart guy and a pretty darn good friend? So make sure you stick around for my deep dish discussion. And remember, we'll be back with part 2, how to make freedom practical and real. We'll be back in just a moment. And welcome back for my carry-out order with Father Roger Landry. I learned a lot. Wanted to stay kind of like in the level of theory when it comes to freedom, because a lot of people just want to jump right into, I'm free to do whatever I want. And honestly, that's just going to create anarchy. And that anarchy creates, as the founding fathers of a democratic society would say, that anarchy is when you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, with whoever you want. It creates a world that is short, brutish, and dull. I remember that from my political philosophy classes, because we need to have laws, and laws sometimes restrict our freedom. And so Father Landry reminded me that what we've got to do is realize that it's not a freedom from only, but it's a freedom to. So there is a kind of a two-way street when it comes to freedom. And a lot of people want to only approach it as a one-way street. Don't stop me. I can do whatever I want. But you see, there are a lot of other people on the road. And if we are to use that analogy, St. John Paul II, and he was really quoting from the Catechism, and of course that's what exactly Father Landry would be doing. This is section 1730, Part 3, Life in Christ, Section 1. But if you just go to the article 1730, you're going to find a whole section on the Catechism that talks about freedom, and it was beautifully summed up when St. John Paul II writes about we need to be liberated from ignorance and be free to search out the truth. We need to be liberated from the subjectivity that says my good is just as good as anyone else's, and really look to the objective good. We have to be free from hate in order to be free to love. We need to be free from this idea that I have no obligations or responsibilities, to realize that you have to be free to achieve the goals of your responsibility. I mean, think about marriage, for example. You have to be free from other obligations in order to be free to love your spouse. Freedom is not easy. It's cliche, but it's true. It's worth saying again that freedom is not free. It comes at a great, great cost. And if we don't understand that, then we literally become slaves to another form of freedom, and that is really governed by the tyranny of relativism. And that relativism, again, just says that you're the only one on the road and that you have no other rights or responsibilities. That ain't free. But in the second part of this show, in the second show with Father Roger Landry, we're going to talk about the practical ways to make free realistic in our life. So as far as this show is concerned, I was just absolutely grateful for the concise approach that Father Landry took to help us understand that before we could just approach freedom from a sociological point of view, it's like everything needs to be free. Colleges need to be free. Before we approach freedom as only a biological truth, I can do whatever I want to do with my body. It's my right. It's my body. It's my choice. Or before we can have a right to approach freedom from a psychological point of view, which again, the word means the logic of the soul, not the logic of the mind, which basically leads to relativism because a lot of the corruption begins in our way of thinking. Father Landry had it right. We need to approach it through a theological understanding of freedom, because that's what God wants to give to us. Freedom to do the right thing when we know the difference between right and wrong. You are free to choose. So thanks again to Father Roger Landry. If you want to support us in our efforts to bring about conversions, one conversation at a time, all you've got to do is go to platinggrace.com, click on the Academy, and you will become a member. And by joining different tiers, you'll not only support our work, you'll also gain access to premium content. So between now and the next time we shoot the shiitake, thank you for listening and stay hungry.